Hello, everybody, and welcome to Step into the Pivot. We have a tremendously brave guest with us today, Claudia St. And Claudia, I want to welcome you to the show and say a massive thank you for being a yes, let's with your story that we're going to get into in a moment. Claudia, welcome.
Thank you so much. And it's absolutely my pleasure to be here with you.
I am starting off here by highlighting, that you're so brave and that I'm so grateful that you are a yes, let's for talking about, some of the most, profoundly painful things that have happened to you that I know that when our guest shares, our audience will, perhaps not relate by way of, oh, that happened to me too, because you have some very unique experiences. But your willingness to talk to us about the depths of your feelings, that's going to be relatable. I know that. And I know that in your work as the founder and CEO of the Workplace Advisors, there is a lot of this, navigating the evolving landscape of people's experiences with regards to all things HR. And there's going to be a lot of stories that run in the background of people, you know, looking for jobs and hiring. So when you work with talent acquisition and with engagement and with retention, what I think is just so interesting to highlight from your bio that, of course, our audience can read more about you in on our website is that I'm sure that you're someone who can really tap into the magnitude of the human experience given what you've been through.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
without further ado, I'll pass it over to Teresa to further introduce you, and
Yeah.
we'll get into the story.
Yeah. So Claudia and I have known each other for a number of years. And actually I was one of your clients, right?
Yeah.
And
That's right.
so when I owned my TPA firm. We just gotten to know each other over the years. We've done a few events together, which is amazing. You told this story last year at a conference I was at, and I was blown away. And I don't know if that was the first time you told this story, but I
That
think
was
it
the
was
first
probably
time.
it was the
Yes.
first time and the first time for sure in front of a live audience that I knew.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I don't want to really, I really want you to tell this story. And just for our listeners, we're going to let Claudia kind of tell the story. Doesn't mean we won't break in. And then in the second part, which will be in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk more about how this has affected her and made her pivot in a lot of ways. So, Claudia, thank you again for being on. And it's all yours, my friend.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. It's a story that I think does have a shock value, and I'll go straight into it. But the reason for telling it, I'd like to start off by saying, is that the worst thing that's ever happened to me in my life is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And I think other people, they've had really hard things happen to them in their lives that may not be the same or may not be as big as this story is, but it's still the most important thing and the biggest things that ever happened in their life. And it brings me great comfort to know that if other people can see resilience. I don't know. Courage doesn't necessarily. I feel like if it's courage, I would be wearing a cape and running into fires. And I don't feel that I'm a particularly brave person that way, but I am a very resilient person. And you wouldn't have expected that I needed to be resilient because I was raised from an outward perspective, a very comfortable environment. My parents were professionals. My grandmother, I come from a family of significant wealth, New York City, born and raised, all of the trappings of a pretty upper income family. But my family was always dysfunctional. My mother was an only child, lonely and kind of isolated. And my father was a Texan who had moved to New York City to achieve a higher level of life. And my my grandparents weren't particularly happy about the marriage. My grandmother and grandfather were displeased because my father really wasn't up to their standard of expectation from my mother, who went to Harvard and had a great pedigree. And so being raised in that environment, there were the trappings of comfort, but it wasn't a comfortable upbringing. My parents were very volatile. My mother in particular was very volatile. And I learned very, very early on, and I didn't even realize this until later in life. I learned early on that my superpower, my superhero, the cape, is I'm able to really pick up a mood very, very quickly and navigate it, know how to stay safe, know how to keep myself safe and others safe, how to shift a mood, how to change a mood, and really how to please others so that there was as little conflict as possible. And that really is how I developed into the person that I am, how I went into human resources, how I connect to people. I was very, very close with my father, incredibly close with my father. And we shared everything that he was interested in, I wanted to pursue. So things such as fishing and hiking and the outdoors. When I was a senior in college, I went home for Christmas one year, and I had lived with my grandmother for a couple of years. She had a place in Sutton Place in Manhattan. And the last couple of years of my college, it wasn't comfortable for me to go home. I didn't particularly feel safe at home, not physically, but emotionally safe. And so I would live with my grandmother. And my grandmother had shared with me in the last couple of years of her life that she didn't trust my father and that she suspected that he had been embezzling money from her and that my mother was somehow complicit in this and not protecting her. And I didn't believe it. I couldn't fathom that that would be true. And I poo-pooed her concerns. I shared them with my family, but they disregarded them. And so on Christmas, I was home and she had stayed with us. We had lived out just outside of Manhattan on the Hudson River in Piermont, New York. And the day after Christmas, she was to go back to Manhattan, and my father had insisted that it was time for her to go back. And my mother wanted her to go back, but she didn't want to go back. She was sad. She was lonely. She didn't want to go back to this big house by herself in the city. So there was a big dust up and they got into a disagreement. And eventually my father said, you know what, it's fine. Just spend the night. It's fine. You don't have to go back. And so I was irritated because of the disagreement. And I ended up being very harsh with my grandmother and saying, why are you being this way? We've had a lovely holiday. Why are you pushing it? Things can go sideways. Why are you pushing it? And I upset her, and I brought her to tears, which was horrifying to me because I'd never done that before. And so that night was the day after Christmas. That was the 26th. And the next morning, when it was about 7 o'clock in the morning, my parents came into my room and brought me the news that my grandmother had died, that she had apparently gotten up in the middle of the night and perhaps gone to go to the bathroom. She was staying in our den that was converted with the sofa bed into the room that she was staying in. And she had gotten out of bed and walked over and perhaps fainted, perhaps had a heart attack and fell on the brick hearth and had struck her head and had died. And my parents woke me with this information and then asked me, not in so many words, but had implicitly asked that I clean it up. There was a lot of blood. It was very gory. It was very traumatic. And I did that. And that led me to a lot of trauma, a lot of trying to drown the visions that I had in my head, the memories, that just seeing such things in alcohol and just trying to move on. But eventually I did. And I also had this terrible shame that I had somehow or another done this to her because I had made her cry the night that she had passed. And so, uh, and so that was about 30 years ago now, and maybe even more. And then life moved on. We never really talked about it again. That was how she passed. It was traumatic. People die in their homes. It happens. And that was that until about 10 years ago, in 2015, which would have been 26 years. So it's been 26 years after my grandmother had died. I was visiting my parents, my sister and I were there, and my father, we were talking about my grandmother, and my father had had a big vodka and was sitting out on the back porch, and we were talking about grandma, and he said, I have a story if you want to hear a story about grandma. And we turned to him and he said, yeah, I killed her. I killed her because she was selfish. I killed her because she wouldn't give us money and I needed money. I killed her because she hated me and I hated her. And she was a lonely old woman and she needed to die. And to hear that from my father, who I was so close to, and to immediately be revisited by all of the images of my grandmother's body, and to know that my father had intentionally put me in that situation, and to not have any sense of my mother's involvement in it was, I can say, the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And then I was met with a really hard question, which is, what do you do when you discover that your father is a murderer and is not at all apologetic, regrets nothing other than having told us? And so I spent about a month really investigating what were the early signs. My father was 90 at this time. What does dementia look like? How does it show up? Is there anything I can point to as a mitigator or an excuse? Is this dementia? Is this, can I find anything? I talked to geriatric doctors, I talked to prosecutors, I talked to priests, I even talked to David Kaczynski. David Kaczynski was the Unabomber. I talked to Ted Kaczynski was the Unabomber, and I ended up talking to his brother, who was the person who turned him in, all trying to figure out, what do I do with this information? And after about a month of incredibly deteriorating health, I realized I'm raising two boys. They were 13 and 15 at the time. And if I didn't say anything or do anything, if I didn't tell anybody, it would essentially be my decision and my sister's decision. She was very much part of this. It would be our adjudicating his fate. It would be us deciding whether he should pay in societal terms for his actions. And so the day after my father confessed, I told him I would never see him again. And I told him that I had every intention of going to the police. And then I did all of the research. And then one day my sister called and said, I've started the process. I called our local police in Pennsylvania. They told me that we either had to turn him in or they were going to notify the local police. And so my sister and I called the local police department and turned our father in for murder. We knew the detective. He had actually been a rookie showing up at my grandmother's death at that moment when he was fresh out of police academy. And they took about 4 months to investigate it. And then they went up and arrested my father. He confessed to all of it. He told them everything that I had told him. He had written me letters. There had been a full court press to try to keep me from turning him into the police. even though they didn't know that I already had, but they kept sending me letters and threatening phone calls, and my mother and he, and I ended up turning him into the police. He ended up confessing to everything and then moving to Canada. They moved out of the country. And then the district attorney decided actually not to pursue it. After the detectives had interrogated him and gotten the record and gotten his sworn testimony as they dropped him off, he turned to them and said, "You do know that an old mind is a very fickle one. And what did you say your name was again? Where am I?" And then he smiled at them. And that was when they dropped him off. And the detective told me that they were all just horrified by how cold and calculating it was. And the district attorney realized that any first-year law student would be able to get him off because of his age if he were to play the senility card.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Yeah. So can I, one of the things I know you talked about that I'd love for you to talk about before we kind of break in, for this piece of the story, you talk about that day on the porch, and you talk about how after he told you, of course you and your sister were very upset, and how then he tried to pretend that it was a joke.
Yes.
Can you talk just a little, because I think it's very interesting to me that he kind of played that there too, especially after what you just said.
Yeah, after he told us that night, I ran out of the room and collapsed in the front lawn, and my sister reached me, and I was getting sick in the lawn, and things that happen in incredible trauma. And so we ended up sitting outside, and my mother came and joined us, thinking, what, just trying to process it. We were absolutely in shock. And yet I knew that he had done it. I just knew it. There were things about the scene where my grandmother lay that didn't make sense. She wasn't where she had fallen. She had been moved. She was on the wrong side of the bed. There was so much blood, but it just, so many things about it didn't make sense to me. So after we were sitting outside, we went inside, and my father was inside watching television, eating dinner. And I walked into him, and I was furious. I don't know what I was. And I said, "You didn't do it, did you?" And he looked at me and he said, "I don't know. Do you think I did?" And smiled. And then my mother came in behind him and said, "No, Brad, you didn't do that, did you? You didn't do it." And he looked at her and said, "No, honey, of course I didn't. Of course I didn't. Did I, Claudia?" And it was then that I realized he was and he had his eyes were dead, He was playing cat and mouse. And I was just a part of the landscape, really, as were we all. I mean, he was a pure, unadulterated psychopath. And I never knew it. I hadn't known it. But it was quite evident that in the last days, I should say, I did have communication with him. I did talk to him a few times before I finally cut it off entirely. And when I did, he never denied that he killed her. He would just play this cat and mouse with it. But when it was just the two of us, because I sat down with him before I left the time that he told us, before I finally left and never went back, I said, "I need to know everything. I need to know why. I need to know how. I need to know everything." And he sat down and told me everything about it, how he had suffocated her, how he had planned it, how he had wanted to kill her for years, how he had wanted to kill her on Christmas Eve. And he said he was too afraid, and he was too weak, and he didn't do it again on Christmas night because he was afraid. And so when she stayed, she gave him one more opportunity. It was all part of this master thing. And I asked him, I said, why did you tell us? I mean, you got away with it. And he said, "Do you know how hard it is to commit the perfect murder and never tell anybody. And I thought, Jesus, this is like a bad true crime movie on television.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I forget what your question was, Teresa.
That's okay. I think this is a really great place for us to pause for this episode. And to our listeners, listen in a couple weeks when we come back with the second part of our story with Claudia St. John.